seats, but many of the Democrat seats remain empty at this point.
But this will be one of those rare moments by the end of this vote when all, well, I was going to say 100 seats, 99 seats will be filled. Steve Daines is walking his daughter down the aisle, but now the vote is going to be taken. Let's listen in.
Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Sergeant at Arms has restored order in the galleries. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The clerk may continue.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Continue.
Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn.
Senator will suspend. Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Zoom.
Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Mr. Donnelly. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Continue.
Mr. Flake. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. No. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. No. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Aye. Mr. Isaacson. Aye. Mr. Johnson. Aye. Mr. Jones. No. Mr. Kane. No. Mr. Kennedy. Aye. Mr. King. No. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Langford. Aye. Mr. Leahy. No. Mr. Lee. Aye. Mr. Manchin.
Clerk will suspend. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Clerk may continue.
Mr. Markey. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
With my friend, the senator from Montana, Senator Daines, who is walking his daughter down the aisle this afternoon. If he were present and voting, he would have voted aye. I have voted no. The pair will not change the outcome of the vote. I therefore withdraw my vote.
The senator has that right.
Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Flake, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson, Kennedy, Kyle, Langford, Lee, Manchin, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Perdue, Portman.
We are going to pause for a moment now to let our Fox stations join us.
Scott, Shelby, Sullivan.
Welcome to our Fox News Live coverage of the Senate vote to confirm Brett Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court. I'm Chris Wallace.
And I'm Shannon Breen. We are here in Washington. You're going to listen live as they're talking through the votes now, the roll call, as you listen to hear the tallies, what at this moment appear to be a confirmation for Kavanaugh.
Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Coons, Cortez Masto, Donnelly, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Harris, Hassan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Jones, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Murray, Nelson, Peters, Reed, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Udall, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy, no.
What's going on right now is that they are waiting for senators who missed the first roll call, and there were a few who did, to come to the floor and to vote, and then they'll have the final tally, which is going to show that the Senate has voted to confirm Judge Kavanaugh.
And just moments ago, people saw Senator Lisa Murkowski, a Republican who's voting no, step up to say she's essentially pairing her vote. It's something they can do in the Senate where someone has to be away. We've talked about GOP Senator Steve Daines is away at his daughter's wedding today in Montana. They have an agreement where she's voting no, he's voting yes. They pair their votes since they offset each other. Essentially, she pulls back her vote and votes present in essence, and that would get us to 50, 48, and 1.
It's good to see that somebody has the right sense of priority, Shannon, and he apparently flatly said, Steve Daines, I don't care if it's a Senate confirmation vote, I am walking my daughter down the aisle.
It sparked a lot of conversations in families. What would you do in that moment? Now, he did have a backup plan in that a congressman from Montana, Giaforte, had said, I will allow you to use my private plane if necessary, if you needed to get there. So there was always a backup plan for him to be here if needed. And he said he didn't want the judge to ever think he was wavering. They had a private phone call, and he said to him, I'll be there if you need me. But because of this agreement they've worked out today, it looks like he can enjoy the wedding.
early in the roll call, before we came on to the national Fox network, there was quite a lot of disruption. In fact, very unusual amount of disruption in the Senate gallery. There are 121 public seats there, and anyone after they pass through security can come and sit in the gallery. And in fact, they're strictly admonished. You're not allowed to show either any support or any disagreement with any decision or any statement that's made. You're there to sit and watch the senators do what they did. But when they began the roll call, it sounded mostly like female voices shouting very much in opposition to the Kavanaugh nomination, and particularly when Jeff Flake, who was considered one of the key swing votes, was voting for Kavanaugh, you could hear one of the female protesters up in the Senate gallery shout and call Flake a coward, and she was escorted out. We're told of those 121 seats left.
Mr. Carper.
Here we go. Waiting for some stragglers, and I can tell you these senators.
Carper, no.
Waiting for stragglers, and as I say, these senators very much want to get on planes and fly home. It is a holiday weekend, and they want to go back to their states, but they're waiting for this vote to be completed. So whoever it is that hasn't voted yet is not going to be popular.
Looks like we got the final vote in that we're going to get today.
As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate gallery. Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to vote or change a vote? If not, on this vote, the ayes are 50, the nays are 48. The nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh of Maryland to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is confirmed.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask consent the motion.